Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final part of my Progressive Era lecture series. Today we will be talking about the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and some of his accomplishments looking in the domestic realm during his first term, and then we will conclude the video with the takeaways from the unit as a whole. So, without any further ado, let us begin. So, as we discussed yesterday, Wilson wins the election of 1912. And so, one of the first things he does is he sets out to reform tariffs, which we also discussed back then, tariffs being a tax imposed on foreign goods with the intent of making domestically produced goods cheaper. President Wilson went to Congress himself to open their session, and he spoke about tariff reform as his main issue. He says that he wants a tariff that would protect fledgling industry in the United States from foreign competition, but only protect those that needed it. So big companies and trusts who don't need tariff protection won't receive it. So companies like Standard Oil, which granted by this time is being broken up, but larger conglomerate companies that are working on a global scale don't really need protection from foreign industries' influence because they're just big enough to absorb that or find a way to work around that. So they don't need a tariff to protect them because they're already set. So he's like, we don't need to protect somebody who doesn't need protection, so let's not do that. And this eventually comes to pass in the Underwood-Simmons bill, which he passes, and that was really the first real tariff reform in the United States since the Civil War. Another thing that Wilson worked on was banking reform as well, in which he saw this need for a currency that would expand and contract as the economy required. And he was trying to do this, and his reason for doing this was to address the issue of the money supply lagging much farther behind the increasing output of goods and services in the United States since the 1870s. So if you remember way back, we were talking about free silver and things like that. Well, he's trying to address that issue and say we need a money that can expand and contract. We don't have all these people saying, oh, we need free silver. Oh, we need free silver. No. He's like, we don't need to do that. We're going to have a currency that will be able to flex with the needs of the economy. And additionally, he's also trying to prevent a bank run. So if you don't know what a bank run is, it's when because a bank doesn't have all the money it has in its coffers or in its deposits on site. And a run was basically where everybody would run into the bank and withdraw all their money. And the problem is that because the bank doesn't keep all that money on site, it will eventually run out of money and have to close. And so they're trying to avoid that happening. One of the reasons that this was such an issue was because of something called on-call loans, in which the debtor can take out money, but if the creditor, so the bank that he takes out the money from, says, I need the money now, he has to pay it right then and there. That's the end of it. This often was taken out by stock speculators, people trying to buy and sell stocks. So essentially what happens is small banks get ran on. And so they ask larger banks, because what happens, this is an economics lesson you can look at here. A small bank would put their reserve cash into a larger bank and lend that to the larger bank. And then that larger bank would then lend that money to creditors and stock people via these margin, the term I know is margin, but these on-call loans. And so people get worried. They run to the bank and ask for their money. The bank says, we don't have all the money. So they go to the bigger bank and they say, hey, call up, we need our money back, and the bigger bank doesn't have all their money because they sold it off to the creditors. So they go to the creditors and the stock people and say, hey, give us our money back. And so then those stock people sell all their stock. And because of all this selling of stock, the stock market winds up going straight down the tubes because all this stock is suddenly just flooding the market. And nobody's buying it because they're trying to repay their loans, which causes a stock market crash. And so to kind of mitigate this, we see the passage in 1913 of the Federal Reserve Act. And what this does is it divides the country into 12 banking districts. Each district will have a Federal Reserve Bank that is owned by member banks. And each national bank has to become a member of the Federal Reserve System. So each member bank, and additionally, each member bank would give a portion of its surplus to the reserve bank in their district. So another little bit economics thing. What it does is it basically makes it so that way these banks will always have money, and this Federal Reserve Bank is supposed to keep that money and hold on to it and not sell it out, so that there will be a secure place to store the other bank's money, so that they don't have it in the case of a run. They will have their money. Additionally, the job of the federal bank was, as I said, to hold the reserves of the member banks, and they were also supposed to lend money to a member bank when it was needed. And so this is where we see the creation of a new currency, Federal Reserve Notes. If you were to take out a dollar bill right now, I'm not going to, you can pause the video and do it if you want. If you look on the back, or somewhere on there, it will say Federal Reserve Note. And that is what these are, is Federal Reserve Notes. So it is a piece of currency that is used for the dollar bill, because the way before it used to work was each bank would actually have their own type of currency printed. Oftentimes I've heard of some small banks in the United States during this time being kind of fly-by-night operations where all the bank would really be would be a suitcase full of money in a back room of a hotel, and that's all the bank would be. But this is supposed to standardize the production of money in the United States and the system of money that's being used in the United States. This act also creates a way to mobilize the banking reserves in times of financial panic. And it kind of exemplifies the concept of new freedom in the sense that private industry is doing the actual physical work of this system, but it's being overseen by the public. So the actual hard labor being done in this scenario is being done by the banks, the privately owned banks. But the government is overseeing what they're doing. So they're looking and they're watching to make sure they're doing it right, but they're letting the banks kind of do it themselves. It's kind of a voluntary. Additionally, another portion of New Freedom was going after the trusts. So Wilson continued Teddy Roosevelt and Taft's policies of going after trusts. So Wilson claims that the Sherman Antitrust Act does not go far enough in its persecution of trusts, and he asked for a law that would provide the active dismantling of monopolies in the United States. So he's like, we need to actively, there's no good or bad, we just need to actively dismantle these monopolies in the United States and get rid of them. And so this leads to the successor to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. And what it does is it prohibits a company from taking over the stock of another company if that purchase would create a monopoly. Additionally, this act forbids anybody from serving as the director of two or more corporations when the effect of this was to lessen competition. So this is a case of where we would see vertical and horizontal integration, as we talked about in the last unit, where we would see people being say, Andrew Carnegie would also end up being the CEO or the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he would also be on the board of directors of another railroad, or he would be on the board of directors for another railroad, and he'd use those railroads to transport his steel and the coal from the coal mines with Henry Fricks. So you'd have businessmen being the chairman of several different companies or on the board of directors of several different companies and essentially controlling those companies from one person. And so with Clayton, they're like, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't do that anymore. Oh, you can't. You have to pick one company and stay with it. You can't keep jumping around playing hopscotch like this. No. They kind of close that loophole with the Clayton Antitrust Act. Another bill that was passed was the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. Also, funnily enough, the same year that World War I started. So while Europe is getting itself into a war, this is happening in the United States. It established the Federal Trade Commission, which is still around today, and it was made of 5 members from different industries in the United States. These members would draw up rules that outline what constituted fair trade in the U.S. So they're actually having the businesses say, this is what we think the rules for fair trade are. And it's kind of similar to when you have a classroom at the beginning of the year, the teacher will say, okay, class, draw up rules of how we think we should all act in this class. And then the teacher will look at them and say, yep, that one's good, nope, that one's not good, we can't have that one. But, so there's kind of the companies and the government are working together to regulate themselves in a way. And what they did is if the members of the FTC found a company that was engaging in unfair business practices, then they could issue a cease and desist order in saying, hey, stop doing that thing. That's bad. You shouldn't do that. And if they disobeyed, they were punished either by fines, legal action. If necessary, you could break the company up, most likely. But ways like that. It's another example of the government working together with businesses under this new freedom to regulate themselves and have a more cooperative sense of regulation versus just Teddy Roosevelt's kind of the government says, you do this thing because we say to. No, it's more like we're going to work together with you to create a better society, you could say. A couple of other acts that are relevant in terms of like labor and generally going along with this progressive mode. We see the Lafayette-Siemens Act of 1915, which improves the living quarters, food, and wages for workers in the merchant marine, so people working on ships going across the ocean back and forth. We see the Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916, which means that farmers can receive government loans at low interest rates, and these loans are meant to buy crops, buy new machinery, so that they can produce more and better sustain themselves. We also see the child labor laws being passed, and I don't really have a name because there's several of them. And these generally limit the employment of young children in factories, mines, and quarries. And we had seen this already, but this is being passed on a federal level, not just a state level. So it's like the state of New Jersey would pass a women's minimum wage law or a child labor law, and then Massachusetts would pass one, and then maybe like, Minnesota would pass one, but say Pennsylvania hasn't passed one yet. Well, in this case, it's a federal act, so now all the states it applies to. So this is the actual federal government saying, now this applies to the entire country, and we're not just leaving it up to the states to decide whether or not we can enact legislation like this. Additionally, we see an 8-hour workday enacted for railroad workers, and that is, I think, quite an important issue even today, because you need to have a limited. Especially that's an industry, especially one of some industries, especially where you should have regulation. Because if you have a railroad worker who's, say, an engineer, and he's been going for 16 hours and he's falling asleep, well, if you have an engineer fall asleep at the wheel, as you can see in some recent events, we still have this happen. You can wind up crashing the train and people are being killed. Just recently, there was an issue where a engineer fell asleep driving his train into the Hoboken train station, and he wound up crashing into the station and killing a woman who was standing on the platform. Very, very tragic and sad. So, they passed a legislation. However, it is still an issue to this day. So, this kind of being the end of this unit, let's kind of look at some of the takeaways from the progressive era as a whole. So, the progressive era was defined by a desire from America as a whole to right the wrongs committed by greedy businessmen and corrupt politicians during the Gilded Age. This time period was defined by reform of all aspects of life, government, business, and social norms, as we saw with, for example, the temperance movement. American presidents took a much more active role in enforcing antitrust legislation than their Gilded Age counterparts, actively breaking up trusts in a practice that became known as trust busting. So as we talked about with Chester, we mentioned briefly in class, Chester A. Arthur, McKinley, Grover Cleveland, those people were kind of very hands-off in their presidency. And then Theodore Roosevelt comes in saying, why? You guys should be we have this law, use it. You guys aren't doing your jobs. So then TR comes in and he starts doing that and going after trusts. And then Taft comes in and takes that even further, which TR doesn't like. And then Wilson comes back in after the election of 1912 and continues extending that philosophy of we need to go after these trusts and we need to enforce these laws and not just sit back and let these guys run around and ruin the country, essentially. That's the philosophy that they're having. And so, that being said, this concludes the last video in the Progressives unit. We will be picking up again, since Easter break is coming, we'll be picking up again on Monday with our American Imperialism unit. No, not Monday. Whenever we resume, we'll be picking up with our American Imperialism unit, and then we'll be looking at, while this era is happening during the 1900s, early 1900s, 1900 to 1911-ish, what's been going on abroad? So, for example, the progressive era, we've been looking at what's been going on during this time period at home, but in the next chapter we will be looking at what's been going on concerning the U.S. and the larger world around it. So we're going to be looking at the United States and the rest of the world during the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt, McKinley, Taft, Wilson, and then following that, we're going to look at the United States in World War I. So that's the next two chapters outlined for you there. And so that being said, this is the end of the video. I'll see you guys next time we resume. You guys have a good rest of your days. Stay safe.